Our reading this morning is from Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 to 11, and can be found on page 1184 in the church Bibles. These can be found under the seat in front of you or at the end of your pew upstairs. That's on page 1184, chapter 3, beginning to read at verse 1. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways, in the life you once lived. But you now must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge in the image of its creator. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for reading. Let's pray, shall we, as we come to the Lord's word together. Father, as we come to your word, please may we find it a lamp for our feet, a light for our path, and please might we encounter in it your ascended, reigning Son, that we might know him and love him and serve him. In his name, amen. Well, we're going to be thinking this morning about how people change. How do people get changed and transformed more and more into the people that they ought to be? How does that kind of change happen? Now, if there are any leaders of governments in the room this morning, on the off chance, hopefully that's a topic that you are interested in. After all, almost all of the great issues of the day could be solved, or at least helped, if people changed. It's one of the big messages a couple of years ago from the COP26 climate conference, was that individual choices are really key to the climate crisis. If people changed, we'd make some strides. And I guess one of the reasons why the business of being a government is complicated is that people don't change very easily. I suspect there aren't any leaders of governments in the room, but I know that there are some parents in the room, and I imagine that this question is of great interest to you, because you want your kids to change and grow in character and maturity and wisdom. Well, I don't know, maybe all the kids at St. Ebbe's are already kind of there straight away, but just on the off chance that they're not, this is worth thinking about. One thing I definitely know is that there are some Christians in the room. And if you are a Christian, you want to change, don't you? Because to be a Christian is to have met someone who is absolutely perfect and entirely beautiful, and we long to be more like him. In some ways, a good measure of how healthy we are as Christians is how much we are conscious of desire to change. If you think of your life and you think, I'm pretty much the way that I would like to be, it's actually quite a bad sign spiritually. But if you think, yeah, I know God and I know that I fall short of him and I long to be different and to change, then that is health. We've been spending the last few weeks at 10 a.m. in this letter to the Colossians, and it's written to church in Colossae in the first century, which seems to have been full of Christians who wanted to change. They'd come to know God, having heard about Jesus, and they love Jesus and they're excited about being Christians, and they want to grow and they want to change and they want to feel closer to God. So they are what we might call keen Christians. But we've said a few times, it seems to be the case that some teachers have popped up on the scene in Colossae, and they've said, in effect, oh, great, you want to grow in relationship with God, you want to change, we can help with that. We've got some strategies. Here is the plan, they say, for how you're going to change, how you're going to be more how you want to be. Jesus is involved in the process and the stuff that he's done on the cross and in his resurrection. So do keep him in mind, but there are one or two extra bits that you're going to need to think about. They say there's these rituals that the Old Testament talked about, and if you are really up for change, if you're really up for being a Christian, then you will keep them. Back in chapter 2, verse 16, if you flick back, you'll see it. They judge people by what they eat or drink or with regard to a religious festival. And they say, actually, there are ways that you can access what's going on in heaven. You can participate in it. 2:17, you can join in the worship of, 2:18, you can join in the worship of angels. And they say the way that you can change is to create some rules, to restrain yourself more, we saw in chapter 2, verse 21. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. That's the kind of stuff, they say, that is going to lead to change. Yeah, Jesus, but also these things. And that is part of what this letter has been written to demolish, really. It's as though the Apostle Paul has said, yeah, Jesus, but. Like, how can there be, yeah, Jesus, but? How can you add to? How can you improve on Jesus? He's all there is. What he's done is enough. You don't need addition to him. The way that people change can't be to add some bits to Jesus. Sort of what we had so far. And it gets us to the end of chapter 2. And now chapter 3 is where I think Paul starts his own answer. He's saying, okay, if the way to change is not rules and legislation and visions and whatnot, we still want to change. So how does it happen? Chapter 3, verse 1 to 11 is the beginning of Paul's answer. And we're going to see two things about how people change. Two things we need to do. Embrace reality and adjust to reality. So the first one, from verse 1 to 4, change comes as we embrace reality. These first 4 verses say some things are true of Christians that sound like they can't possibly be right. Verse 1, since then, you have been raised with Christ. Or verse 3, for you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. Verse 4, Christ, who is your life. Now, I can just about believe that those things might be true in the future. I can just about get my head around the thought that one day I will die, and then after that I will be raised, and then I'll be in heaven, so then my life will be hidden with Christ, and then Jesus will be my whole life. And those are not small things to say, nor easy things to believe, but actually Paul is saying something even bigger here. He's saying that those things are not just your future, they are your present, if you're a Christian. Someone puts their trust in Jesus, old life has ended, they have died. But then, as we've been thinking about this morning, just as Jesus rose and ascended into heaven, those who trust him now share those experiences. We have been raised with Christ, Paul says. And verse 3, our life is hidden with Christ in God. So spiritually, we are where Jesus is. We are seated at the right hand of God. And for now, that's hidden. Verse 3, your life is hidden with Christ in God. It's not the sort of thing that you can see with your eyes. People can't look at you and tell that spiritually you're seated in heaven with God. But verse 4 says one day it's going to be revealed. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear. So it's hidden for now. One day it's going to be visible. There's old Ascension Sunday hymn where we sing to Jesus, "Thou hast raised our human nature in the clouds to God's right hand. There we sit in heavenly places. There with thee in glory stand. Now, what do you think so far? Paul is saying, you've died, you've been raised, you've ascended into heaven so that you are right there with Jesus at the Father's right hand. One day that reality is going to become visible. What do you think? If you're anything like me, your instinctive response to that is, no, I haven't. Died and been raised? No, I haven't. I don't remember that. That can't possibly be true of me. But I tell you another time I had that sort of a thought recently. Over Easter, I went on my first ever long-haul flight, which was an extraordinary experience in lots of ways. But flight took off 6:30, landed 10 hours later, had a look at my watch. My watch said 4:30, 10 hours on from 6:30. Then the pilot's voice comes over the intercom and says, welcome to Auckland, 17 degrees, and local time is 8:30. My watch says 4:30. And then he tells me it's a different day to what I think it is. Now, at that point, I've got two options. Either I can say, no, it isn't. The watch says 4:30. This watch works. This is a Casio F90. This works. And I've checked, and the maths adds up. It was 4:30, 10 hours ago. How can it possibly be Tuesday when yesterday was Wednesday? This can't be right. Silly man. That's my first option. Second option is I change my watch. Because something has happened to my reality that my watch can't account for. I've been caught up in something that my senses can't quite process. And so what I need to do is lean into, to embrace that reality and change my watch. And that is Paul's repeated instruction in these verses, isn't it? Embrace reality. He says, verse 1, since you've been raised with Christ, set your minds on things above and set your hearts. So the key to changing is recognizing that your reality, if you're a Christian, has already changed. And now you need to think about and love and long for the stuff that belongs to your new reality. That is, you need to think about Jesus and who he is and what he's done, and particularly who he's made us, where he has put us spiritually in heaven at God's right hand. The false teachers in Colossae say that the way that you change is either somehow to limit your access to reality, don't touch, don't handle, that is, sort of contain your life in a bubble of rules, or else to try and escape reality and kind of have visions, hang out with angels, all that kind of thing. And I wonder if you could say that the ways the world gives people of changing actually haven't moved on very much from that. Either limit your access to reality, legislation, discipline, effort. Cut out the people from your life who drag you down. Or on the other hand, escape reality, or at least disengage from reality. And it's often Eastern religions will say that we need to disengage from our surroundings a little bit. We need to want the things in this world less. Or social media offers us the opportunity to cultivate our own version of reality that suits us better. Either kind of limit my access to reality or escape from it. But Paul says you will only change if you embrace ultimate reality. If you set your mind, set your hearts on what's become true of you. Last week I was chatting to a student who had become a Christian not that long ago. And the thing that he experienced when that happened was that he found in himself, for the first time, a desire to please God. He recognized the fact that he was a new person because of Jesus, and he just felt that he wanted to live new. He wanted to live out that newness. And he said that was totally different to how it was before he became a Christian, because what happened then was he just kind of was the way he was, and every now and then he'd feel really bad because of his actions, and there would be a burst of guilt-motivated desire to change, to stop being some of the things that he was. But then that would soon pass and life would carry on. But then he became a Christian and it flipped. He realized that it had flipped. Not that he wanted to sort of just stop some things, but rather he wanted to be the person that he had been made out of love and gratitude. He wanted the things that Jesus had made true of him to happen in his life more and more. And that's a process still ongoing in him and in each of us. Paul says, embrace reality. This is how change starts. People trust Jesus. He makes some radical and objective alterations to who they are before God. And then they set their minds on those things, and then slowly change comes from the inside out. Now, I wonder if the heads of government at St. Ebbe's this morning are feeling a little disappointed by that process for social transformation. Because one implication of this is that you cannot have Christian behavior sustainably without Christ. It's only as you fix your mind on him that this change starts to happen. You might have heard recently Richard Dawkins was being interviewed on LBC, I think it was, and he said that he thought of himself as a cultural Christian. That is, he likes to be in a culturally Christian country, but in his words, he doesn't believe a single word of the Christian faith. And the problem that he's got here is that the only soil that Christianity gives you to grow Christian ethics and standards and behavior and stuff is Christ. And therefore you might say, well, if he wants our society to be renewed in its Christian values, what he needs to do is embrace Jesus and tell other people about him with all the energy that he's been telling them other things for the last few years. See, it's only by embracing Jesus that change happens, only by embracing reality and who we are in him. And so this is why we come to church, to embrace reality. This is why we read our Bibles. It's why we sing, because we're laying hold again and again and again of the things that are true of us but that we can't see, and therefore that we so quickly forget. It's as though we all kind of come with a watch that's slightly slow, that we need to change week by week as we embrace these things. Embrace reality. And then secondly, verse 5 to 11, adjust to reality. Because the thing about sort of changing my watch on the aeroplane is that off the back of that, some other things in my life have to fall into place. So it's no good me changing my watch to say it's lunchtime and then still to kind of, put my pajamas on as though it's still 4:30 in the morning as I think it is. Some things have to fall into place off the back of it. And actually, Paul's illustration in this chapter isn't so much to change your watch as to change your clothes. So if you have a look at verse 9, it says, "Do not lie to each other, since you've taken off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self." So you might think of the footballer who has signed for a new team. He's moved from Liverpool to Wolves, where there is an at least equivalent chance of silverware if he makes that move. So he's signed for a new team. And what he's got to do, first of all, is he's got to embrace reality. So he's not just thinking, okay, the rules are now, I mustn't go to Anfield on Saturdays, I mustn't cheer for Liverpool. But no, he's thinking, no, I've got to think like what I am now. I'm a Wolves player. And then he's got to adjust to that reality. That is, take off his Liverpool kit and pull on the old gold. And, start passing to Wolves players and that sort of thing. The rest of this letter, really, but certainly the rest of this passage unpacks what it'll look like when we sign for Jesus, when he changes our reality. And you'll see if you look down, there are two lists of things here to take off. The first one is in verse 5. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature. That is, whatever belongs to your old reality, to your old team. Put to death whatever belongs to your earthly nature. Sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. What do you notice about that list? They're all quite personal things, aren't they? They're all things that kind of happen in the dark privacy of our hearts or the dark privacy of our bedrooms. They're all things to do with wanting, desiring things that it's not right for us to want. And I wonder, as that list was being read earlier, what your heart rate was doing as you heard it. Just zoom in on a couple of them. He starts with sexual immorality, first of all, and that is a category that involves anything outside of God's design for sex within the exclusive and permanent marriage of a man and a woman. And in different ways, this will be a battle for all of us to take off. For an increasing number, both Christians and non-Christians, the particular battleground for sexual immorality is pornography. It's the thing growing fastest of all amongst teenagers and young adults, but actually, I read this week, across every age category, growing as a thing. And it can be a particular battle for people because it's so available, and it's so hidden, and so isolating, and it's likely there'll be some here this morning who feel as though its grip on their lives is unbreakable. But Paul says this is one of the things that we are to put off. That is, it's one of the things that as we fix our eyes on what has become true of us in Jesus, as we lean into our new identity in him, it's something that's going to become increasingly distasteful to us and something that we can make progress in. It can be put off. And so maybe today could be a good day to chat to a friend who you know and trust and start to get some help. The other thing I thought I might just draw attention to on this list very briefly is greed, which is idolatry. The first one and the last one. Greed, which is idolatry. Greed, literally, desire for more. More money, more clothes, newer clothes, another upgrade, more food. Almost always good things, but things that we've tipped over from appreciating into needing, into it being kind of unimaginable to live without. And that's the nature of idolatry, says greed, which is idolatry. It's the nature of idolatry, taking a good thing and depending on it and always needing more and more of it. And it can be hard to put your finger on when you've sort of tipped over from one thing to the other. But I guess if we were to ask a Christian from another part of the world, which of the sins on this list people in a large church in a prestigious Western city are most likely to struggle with, I guess they might draw our attention to this one. Now, the thing about this first list of 5 sins there in verse 5 is that I think the Colossian Christians were probably already trying to deal with them. We know, for example, if you look up to the very top of the page, 223, that they are trying to restrain sensual indulgence. So Paul is saying, you are absolutely right to be fighting these things because, verse 6, because of them, the wrath of God is coming. These are things that you are right to be battling against, Colossians. But the way to do it is not the Colossian way, sort of don't touch, rules, escape reality, all that sort of thing. So fight them with reality, not rules. Fight them by looking to Jesus. But the second list that starts in verse 8, I think might have come as a bit more of a surprise. So having said those ones in verse 5, verse 8, but now you must also rid yourself of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other. So if the first list was all kind of private and hidden and to do with our motivations, this second one is public and visible and to do with our relationships. And it may be that in some ways that first list is a little bit easier to talk about. Someone asks me how they can pray for me. It sounds much more spiritual and impressive to say, well, please will you pray for a growth in my purity of heart. They've got no idea what I'm actually asking for prayer for, but they know that I sure am spiritual if I'm asking for that sort of a prayer. But if I say, will you pray that I wouldn't tell lies to make myself sound more impressive, then they might think I'm awful. Sometimes it's a caricature of people in churches like ours that, we can be very clear in what we believe, got plenty to say about sexual immorality and why that's bad, but just a bit difficult bit sort of angular and grumpy and get cross. And Paul says this is stuff that we've got to put off as well. The way that we treat each other is important for all sorts of reasons. It's important most of all here because of what the gospel is. We live in a world of premium membership and that's students, sort of scholars and commoners, and the first team in the reserves and the front row and the cheap seats. And it seems as though the false teachers in Colossae were trying to sort of make church into a similar thing from that. So we've already seen they look down on people who don't keep the right religious festivals. They judge people who don't have the right sort of spiritual experiences. What they bring is an inherently divisive message that says there are two sorts of Christians, the sort that do this and the sort that don't. Or the sort that have this happen to them and the sort that don't. But the gospel that Paul brings is an inherently and uniquely uniting message. Have a look at verse 11. He says, "Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all." That is, if Jesus is everything to every one of us, and if he is the only qualification that any one of us has to be a part of this community, then there are no cheap seats. How could there be? We are united in him. The only thing that any one of us has as we stand before the Lord is him. And if that's the sort of community that the gospel creates, a united one, then how we relate to each other really matters. We come back to the list of things that Paul mentions in verse 8. There's plenty of things in church life alone that can really annoy you, really just kind of get up your nose. But rage is usually a bad emotion to indulge and run with. And then sometimes you're angry with someone, and the temptation to make sure that everybody else knows how annoying that person is, you can kind of end up making them a little bit worse, making them sound a little bit worse than they actually are, and then we're into a world of malice and slander. And all the while, the kind of trust that we need to function as the community that the Lord has made us to be is being eroded. And the fact that Jesus is everything to every person and he's everything to me is being forgotten. And then, verse 9, he sort of gives its own sentence to lying. As soon as I have to take with a pinch of salt what people say, as soon as I have to factor in a gap between what you said and what the reality probably is, then that's had a massive impact on our chances of living as a verse 11 type of a people. So Paul says that this stuff, this verse 8 and 9 stuff, has got to be put off just as urgently as sexual immorality and all the rest of it. As he takes us through this list, what we're doing is adjusting to reality. He's not saying, you've got to be nice because otherwise it will be bad. But he's saying, no, there's some facts here. There's some reality. We are all only here because we've got Jesus. We're one thing, therefore. How should we live like one thing? So how do people change? We embrace reality. We receive what Jesus has done in all of its kind of scope and grandeur. We believe what he says about who we are now, what our present status is, what our future hope is. And then we change our watch and we start to line up our lives more and more with that reality. Next week, we'll be picking up from verse 12, obviously, where Paul kind of carries on the train of thought and kind of tells us a bit more the positive side. So now that we've changed sides, what do we put on? But here is what we're to put off, and here is the thing that makes it possible. So we embrace reality and then adjust to it. Why don't I pray for the Lord's help in that? It's hard for us to believe that we've been raised with Christ, Father. Hard for us to believe that we've died and we've got a life hidden with him. But you've told us that that's the case. And so we pray that you'd help us to embrace those facts, and that more and more they'd shape our lives. Father, as we've considered these lists of things that are no longer appropriate for us as those with a new life, please would you, by your Spirit, be putting your finger on things in our lives that need to be taken off, and help us to take them off not just because, but because of who we are. In Jesus' name, amen.